My parents refused to help when I was sick. Now they expect me to bankroll and raise my golden brother's abandoned kids. Sup, Reddit. 6 years ago, my parents told me to figure out my own medical crisis while they went on vacation. Last week, they showed up demanding I fund raising my brother's kids after he abandoned them via email. I gave them their own words back, and what followed was a complete shit show that exposed exactly who these people really are. I'm 31 male and haven't spoken to my parents in almost 6 years. Not a single word. No birthday calls, no holiday texts, no awkward run-ins at family gatherings, because I stopped going to those too. Complete radio silence. The breaking point? Type 2 diabetes diagnosis when I was 25, between jobs, and my insurance wouldn't cover the medication I literally needed to stay alive. But before we dive into that particular disaster, let me paint you a picture of my family dynamics, because this whole situation makes way more sense when you understand the pattern. My parents, Richard and Patricia, are your stereotypical suburban middle-class couple who spent 30 years building what they considered a comfortable retirement. Dad worked in manufacturing management, climbed the ladder over decades, ended up making decent money. Mom did accounting for a regional hospital network. Steady work with good benefits. They retired at 62 with a paid-off house in a nice neighborhood, 2 cars that were only a few years old, and enough retirement savings to take annual cruises without even blinking at the cost. They weren't struggling financially. Not even close. They had that comfortable middle-class retirement where you can afford pretty much anything you want within reason. The kind of retirement most people dream about. No mortgage, no debt, pension coming in, 401k sitting there as backup. They were set. My older brother Wyatt is 39, 8 years older than me. That age gap meant we were never really close growing up. By the time I was starting middle school and actually developing a personality, he was already moved out and doing his own thing. We existed in the same family but lived basically separate lives. Growing up, I always felt like the practice kid. You know how some families have that dynamic where the first kid gets all the attention and the second one just kind of exists? That was us. Wyatt was the golden child who could do no wrong. Every milestone he hit was celebrated like he'd cured something major. Meanwhile, I could bring home straight A's and get a pat on the head and a, "That's nice, dear." The favoritism was blatant, but nobody acknowledged it. When Wyatt needed money for anything, car repairs, rent assistance, whatever, my parents were there immediately with open checkbooks. When I needed help, suddenly it became a teaching moment about self-reliance and personal responsibility. I remember being 16 and needing $200 for a school trip. It was this educational thing all my friends were going. I'd been looking forward to it for months. My parents said no. Too expensive. They didn't see the value in it. I needed to learn that not everything in life gets handed to you. 2 weeks later, Wyatt asked for $800 to help with his security deposit on a new apartment. They gave it to him same day. When I pointed out the inconsistency, Dad said it was different because Wyatt was an adult with adult responsibilities. I was just a kid asking for vacation money. That kind of thing happened constantly. Different standards, different rules, different everything depending on which son you were talking about. I learned pretty early that I couldn't rely on them for support. Everything I got, I had to earn or fight for myself. Fast forward to when I was 25. I'd been working at this tech startup for about a year and a half. Not a huge company, maybe 30 employees, but it was growing and I was learning a lot. The pay was decent, benefits were okay, and I was building experience in my field. Then the funding dried up. Investors pulled out. Company couldn't make payroll, and we all got laid off with about 2 weeks' notice. Not ideal, but these things happen. The job market was decent at the time, so I wasn't panicking. Started applying places immediately, had my resume updated, began networking. The plan was to find something within a month or two, bridge the gap with savings, and move forward. Then I started feeling off, constantly thirsty, tired all the time, losing weight without trying, having to use the bathroom every hour. Classic diabetes symptoms, but I didn't recognize them at first. Thought maybe it was stress from the job loss. After 2 weeks of feeling progressively worse, I went to an urgent care clinic. They ran some tests, my blood sugar levels were through the roof, and the doctor looked at me with that expression medical professionals get when they're about to deliver bad news. "You have type 2 diabetes," he said. "Your A1C is 11.2. That's dangerously high. We need to get you on medication immediately." He wrote prescriptions for 2 different medications plus testing supplies. Told me I needed to check my blood sugar multiple times daily, follow a strict diet, and come back in 3 months for follow-up. Then he handed me the prescriptions and wished me luck. I took the scripts to the pharmacy, figuring they'd be expensive but manageable. The pharmacist ran them through my insurance, the COBRA coverage from my old job that I'd signed up for, and came back with a total that made my stomach drop. "That'll be $847 for the month's supply of everything," she said cheerfully. $847 for 1 month. My unemployment benefits were $380 weekly. Even with budgeting, I was looking at maybe $1,600 monthly income. Rent alone was $850. This medication would take more than half of what I had left after housing. I asked about generic versions, discount programs, anything to bring the cost down. She tried a few things, got it down to $780. Still completely unsustainable. I told her I'd have to figure something out and left without the medications. That night, I spent hours researching options. Patient assistance programs that would take months to process. Discount cards that only worked at specific pharmacies. Canadian pharmacies that might be legit but also might not be. Nothing was going to solve my immediate problem of needing medication now and not being able to afford it. I had about $3,000 in savings. That was supposed to be my emergency fund for exactly this kind of situation. But if I spent it all on medication, I'd have nothing for rent, food, or the unexpected expenses that always pop up. I was looking at choosing between my health and having a place to live, so I did what any reasonable person would do when facing a genuine medical emergency with no good options. I called my parents, not asking for a handout, not expecting them to cover everything forever, just looking for temporary help while I got back on my feet. I explained the whole situation, the layoff, the diagnosis, the medication costs, how I had job interviews lined up but needed a bridge for maybe 3 to 4 months until I got hired somewhere with better insurance. I laid out actual numbers. If they could cover maybe $600 monthly for 3 months, that would give me enough breathing room to make everything else work. Dad's response came after about 5 seconds of silence. "You're 25 years old," he said, voice flat. "You need to figure some things out on your own. Don't rely on us just because we're your family." Mom was on speakerphone, and she jumped in with her addition. "We've already raised you. You're an adult now. This is your responsibility to handle." I sat there stunned, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. This was a medical emergency. I wasn't asking them to fund a vacation or buy me a car. I needed medication to not go into diabetic shock. And they were lecturing me about personal responsibility. "So you're saying you won't help at all?" I asked, just to be crystal clear. "We're saying you need to learn to manage your own problems," Dad replied. "We can't bail you out every time life gets difficult." Every time? I'd never asked them for major help before in my adult life. This was literally the first time I'd requested anything significant since moving out. "I have diabetes," I said slowly, trying to make them understand. "Without medication, I could end up in the hospital or worse. This isn't me being irresponsible or lazy. This is a genuine medical crisis." "Then you'll figure out what you need to do," Dad said. "We didn't raise you to come running to us whenever things get tough." Mom added her final gem. "Maybe this is what you need to learn: independence. We've spent too many years enabling you." Enabling me? By not helping me with anything? The logic was non-existent, but I was past the point of arguing. "Got it," I said. "Thanks for nothing." I hung up. That was September 2017. Last time we spoke until 6 weeks ago. Here's what happened in those 6 years. I figured it out on my own, just like they told me to. Sold my car and bought something cheaper, freeing up $200 monthly. Moved to a smaller apartment with a roommate I found through work, cutting rent in half. Applied to every patient assistance program that existed. Filled out mountains of paperwork. Waited through their processing times. Started buying medication from Canadian pharmacies at a quarter of the US price. Found websites that connected Americans with legitimate Canadian pharmacies that would ship across the border. Was it legal? Gray area. Did I care? Not even slightly. I was choosing between following pharmaceutical industry pricing schemes or staying alive. Pretty easy decision when you frame it that way. The first few months were rough. Managing diabetes while dealing with the stress of unemployment and family rejection was like juggling chainsaws while walking a tightrope. Blood sugar all over the place from the stress. Constantly worried about money, wondering if I'd made the right choices. But I handled it, found creative solutions, cut every possible expense, made it work through sheer determination. I landed a new job after 3 months of searching. The insurance was better, brought my medication costs down to manageable levels. I threw myself into work, proved myself valuable, and got promoted within a year. Then again, 2 years after that. Built a reputation as someone reliable who delivered results. Met my now wife Natalie at a friend's barbecue when I was 27. She was smart, funny, had her life together, and didn't come with any family drama attached. We clicked immediately. Started dating, moved in together after a year, got engaged 6 months after that, bought a house when I was 28. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. 3 bedrooms, decent neighborhood, good schools nearby for the kids we were planning to have eventually. Got married at 29 in a small ceremony with Natalie's family and our close friends. My parents weren't invited. They didn't even know it happened until someone probably told them months later. Built an actual life. The kind of stable, successful life my parents always said they wanted for me. Just did it completely without their input or support. My parents? Didn't hear from them once. No calls, no texts, no attempts at reconciliation. They clearly meant what they said about me handling my own problems. Fine by me. Then 6 weeks ago, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. Opened it to find a message from my mom. We need to talk. It's urgent. I stared at that text for a solid minute, sitting there on my couch with Natalie beside me watching a movie. 6 years of complete silence and now something suddenly urgent? My first instinct was to delete it and move on with my life. I didn't respond. She texted again 2 hours later. This is about your nephews. Please call. That got my attention. Wyatt had 2 kids. I knew that much from the occasional Facebook stalking I'd done over the years. Boys, ages 8 and 6 now. I'd never met them. Didn't even know their names until I looked at the Facebook photos Mom had posted over the years that I'd never bothered to engage with. They looked like normal kids, smiling in photos, playing at parks, the usual family stuff. I called, curiosity overcoming better judgment. Part of me wondered if something had happened to Wyatt. Part of me wondered if the kids were in danger. The responsible part of my brain kicked in despite my better judgment. Finally, Mom said when she answered. Not even a hello first. We've been trying to reach you for days. You sent one text, 2 hours ago. 2. Well, this is serious. We need to talk about Wyatt's children. Can you come over? We should discuss this in person. I'm not driving to your house. Whatever you need to say it now. She sighed, like I was the one being difficult here. Fine. It's about the boys, your nephews. They've been living with us for the past 2 months. Okay? And we need help. We're not young anymore. Raising 2 children at our age is exhausting. Where's Wyatt? Another sigh. That's complicated. Uncomplicate it. She launched into the whole story then. Wyatt's wife Jennifer had died in a car accident 8 months ago. Some guy ran a red light, T-boned her car, she died at the scene. Tragic, horrible. The kind of thing nobody should have to go through. Wyatt had apparently been struggling to cope ever since. Started drinking heavily, according to Mom, though she said it in that tone that suggested she was downplaying the severity. Knowing Wyatt's history with substances, he'd had problems in his 20s that my parents had always excused. I suspected drinking heavily meant something pretty severe. Then 2 months ago, Wyatt sent my parents an email. Not a phone call. Not an in-person conversation. An email. Said he needed time to figure things out. That he couldn't handle being a parent right now. That the boys were better off with their grandparents while he got his head together. And then he just disappeared. Stopped responding to calls and texts. My parents had no idea where he was. Could be staying with friends, could be in a motel somewhere, could be halfway across the country for all they knew. He'd essentially abandoned his kids via electronic communication and vanished. Classy move, Wyatt. Really stepping up to the plate there. So what's the plan? I asked Mom. Is he coming back? Is this temporary or permanent? We don't know, she admitted. He's not responding to us. His phone goes straight to voicemail. We've had the boys for 2 months now and we're drowning. That sounds difficult. What do you want from me? We need you to help financially, she said, getting to the point. These boys need things. Food, clothes, school supplies, activities. We're looking at about $1,500 monthly for their expenses. Plus, we're having to look into therapy for them because they're obviously traumatized. I actually laughed. Couldn't help it. The situation was so absurd that laughter was the only appropriate response. You want me to send you $1,500 a month? These are your nephews. Your family. Family takes care of family. I actually laughed. Couldn't help it. You want me to send you $1,500 a month? These are your nephews. Family takes care of family. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. That's interesting, I said. Because 6 years ago, when I needed help with $800 monthly for medication, you told me to figure it out on my own. Said you wouldn't bail me out every time life gets difficult. Silence on the other end. That was different, Mom finally said. How? Explain to me how it was different. You were an adult who needed to learn responsibility. These are children. So when I was between jobs with a medical emergency, that was a teaching moment. But when Wyatt abandons his kids, that's when family steps up. This isn't about keeping score. Dad's voice came through. Apparently, I was on speaker. These boys need help. Then help them. You're retired with money in the bank. You told me you couldn't help with $600 monthly when I was literally sick. Now you're asking for $1,500 for kids that aren't even my responsibility? We're on a fixed income, Mom said. We can't afford to raise 2 children. So figure it out on your own. Don't rely on me just because we're family. I used their exact words back at them. The silence that followed was beautiful. That's different, and you know it, Dad said, voice tight. How? Please explain how this is different from what you told me 6 years ago. Because we actually helped you when you were growing up, Mom snapped. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe us. I owe you? For doing the literal bare minimum that parents are legally required to do? You chose to have kids. That's not some debt I need to repay. We're not asking you to raise them, Dad said. Just help financially while we figure out a long-term solution. And what happens when there's no long-term solution? What happens when Wyatt doesn't come back and these kids need to be raised for the next 10 years? You think I'm going to keep sending checks? Your brother is going through something difficult, Mom said. He'll get himself together. Maybe this is what he needs to learn independence, I said, throwing her words from 6 years ago right back at her. Maybe you've spent too many years enabling him. Don't be cruel, she said. I'm not being cruel. I'm being exactly as supportive as you taught me to be. Remember? You can't bail people out every time life gets difficult. This is completely different, Dad said. These are innocent children. Then be their grandparents. Use your comfortable retirement savings that you couldn't spare $600 from 6 years ago. You'll figure it out. We need your help, Mom said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. No, you need my money. There's a difference. You don't actually want me involved in these kids' lives. You just want me to fund their existence while you two maintain your lifestyle. That's not fair, she protested. You're right. It's not fair. Just like it wasn't fair when you told your diabetic son to figure it out alone while you went on a cruise. But here we are. We didn't go on a cruise right after that, Dad said. 3 months later. Close enough. The point is, you had money for vacations, but not for medication. Now you have money for your retirement, but not for your grandkids. Funny pattern. If you won't help, just say so, Mom said coldly. I won't help. There. I said it. Then you're exactly as selfish as we thought. Good. I learned from the best. I hung up before they could respond. Natalie had been listening to the whole conversation. She walked over and hugged me, and I realized my hands were shaking. You okay? She asked. Yeah, just didn't expect that to feel so satisfying. She laughed. You gave them back everything they gave you. 6 years, I said. 6 years of nothing. And they show up asking for money like we're suddenly family again. The next week, they tried a different approach. Mom called and left a voicemail that was clearly rehearsed. Her voice was breaking in all the right places. Emotional but calculated, hitting every manipulation beat perfectly. Sweetie, it's Mom. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about what happened 6 years ago. And you're right. We should have helped you. We should have been there when you were sick. I don't know what we were thinking. Maybe we were scared. Maybe we didn't understand how serious it was. But we failed you. And I'm sorry for that. Pause for dramatic effect. Sniffle. I know I can't take back what happened. I know we hurt you. But this is a chance for us to move forward as a family, to do the right thing together. These boys need us. They need all of us. Please call me back so we can talk about this properly. I love you. I played that voicemail for Natalie. She looked at me with raised eyebrows. That's possibly the most manipulative thing I've ever heard, she said. She's not even apologizing for what they did. She's apologizing for your feelings about it. Sorry we failed you, I said. Not sorry for telling me to handle my medical emergency alone. Not sorry for going on a cruise 3 months later. Just sorry that I felt bad about it. And immediately followed by asking for money again? Classic non-apology. I'm sorry, but here's why you should do what I want anyway. I didn't call back. The message had been carefully crafted to hit emotional buttons while avoiding actual accountability. If she genuinely wanted to apologize, she would have done it without immediately pivoting back to their demands. 3 days later, they showed up at my house. Just appeared on my doorstep Saturday morning like they had any right to be there. Natalie answered the door while I was in the shower, came upstairs looking equal parts annoyed and amused. Your parents are here, she said. Should I tell them to leave or do you want to handle this? I'll handle it, I said, getting dressed. This should be interesting. I went downstairs to find them sitting in my living room like they owned the place. Dad was looking around at the furniture, the TV, the framed pictures on the walls, assessing everything, calculating what my life was worth. Mom was perched on the edge of the couch, clutching her purse like she was afraid something might jump out at her. "Nice place," Dad said when he saw me. "Doing well for yourself. Must be nice having all this while your nephews struggle." "Right. Starting with guilt trips immediately. Classic move." "What do you want?" I asked, not bothering to sit down. "We want to talk," Mom said. "Have an actual conversation instead of fighting over the phone. We drove an hour to get here. The least you can do is hear us out. There's nothing to talk about. I'm not giving you money. You could have saved the trip. We're not just asking for money," Dad said, leaning forward. "We're asking you to step up for family. These boys are your nephews, whether you acknowledge them or not. They've lost their mother. Their father abandoned them. They need stability and support. And I'm your son, whether you acknowledge it or not. Didn't seem to matter 6 years ago when I needed stability and support." Mom's expression hardened. "You're really going to hold that over us forever? We made one mistake and you're going to punish us for the rest of our lives? One mistake? You told your diabetic son to figure out his medical crisis alone. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. You chose your comfort over my health." "We made a mistake," she repeated, like saying it again would change reality. "We admit that, but you can't seriously compare helping with medication to raising two traumatized children. The situations aren't even remotely similar." "You're right. One situation involved $600 monthly for 3 months, $1,800 total. The other involves $1,500 monthly for years, potentially. Tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. The expensive one you want help with. The cheap one you couldn't be bothered." "Money isn't the point," Dad said, voice rising slightly. "Money is exactly the point. You have enough to raise these kids. You just don't want to spend your retirement savings on them. You want me to fund it so you can keep your lifestyle intact. The cruises, the comfortable retirement, all of it." "That's not true," Mom protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then use your own money. You're not broke. You're comfortable. You have savings, pensions, paid off assets. Prove me wrong." They couldn't. We all knew they had the resources. They just didn't want to use them. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. "What about the boys?" Mom finally asked. "Don't you care what happens to them? They're innocent in all of this. They didn't ask for any of this to happen. I care that they're in a bad situation. I don't think that situation is my responsibility to fix financially. Wyatt abandoned them. That's on him. You're their grandparents who spent years enabling his behavior. That's on you. I'm their uncle they've never met because you cut me out of your lives. That's not on me." "Family is family," Dad said, pulling out what he probably thought was his trump card. "You're right. And when your family member had a medical emergency, you told him to handle it alone. Told him he needed to learn responsibility. Told him you wouldn't bail him out just because life got difficult. When your other family member spent his entire adult life making bad decisions, you enabled every single one. Gave him money whenever he asked. Made excuses for his failures. And now you're shocked that he turned out to be someone who abandons his kids via email. We did the best we could with both of you," Mom said. "No, you did the best for Wyatt and told me to figure it out. Different standards, different rules. Same pattern my whole life. We went back and forth like this for another 20 minutes. Every angle they tried, I shut down. Every guilt trip, I redirected with their own logic from 6 years ago. Every attempt to paint me as the bad guy got flipped back onto them. Dad tried the practical approach. These boys will remember who was there for them and who wasn't. You're building resentment that will last forever. Like the resentment I built when you told me to figure out my medical crisis alone? That kind of lasting resentment? Mom tried the emotional manipulation. We're getting older. We won't be around forever. You'll regret this when we're gone. You know what I'll actually regret? Not standing up for myself 6 years ago. Not calling you out on your selective support. Not recognizing sooner that you only consider me family when you need something." Dad stood up, clearly frustrated. "This conversation is going nowhere. You've made your decision. You're choosing to abandon these children. I'm choosing not to enable Wyatt's irresponsibility with my money. Same way you chose not to enable my medical needs with yours. Full circle." Eventually, they realized they weren't getting anywhere and left. Mom stood up, gathered her purse, looked around my house one more time, like she was cataloging everything she could use against me later. As they walked to the door, she turned around one final time. "You've changed," she said, voice cold. "You used to be such a sweet boy. So kind and caring. I don't even recognize you anymore." "Yeah, well, life changes people. Especially when your parents tell you to figure out life-threatening medical issues on your own. Turns out that kind of abandonment really builds character. We didn't abandon you. You told your diabetic son with no insurance that you wouldn't help with medication costs because he needed to learn responsibility. What would you call that? She didn't have an answer. They left, and I watched them drive away from my window. Natalie came and stood beside me. That was intense, she said. That was necessary. They needed to understand that I'm not going to fold just because they show up and demand things. Do you think they'll keep trying? Probably. People like them don't accept no easily. They're used to getting what they want through guilt and manipulation. I was right. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've gotten texts from extended family members I barely know. Aunts and uncles who haven't spoken to me in years suddenly have very strong opinions about my obligations. Cousins I met maybe twice at childhood birthday parties are lecturing me about family values. The messages follow predictable patterns. Those poor boys need help. How can you be so heartless? Your parents raised you, and this is how you repay them. Family takes care of family. Nobody asks why my parents with a comfortable retirement and paid-off house need financial help from their son. Nobody questions why Wyatt abandoned his children or where he disappeared to. Nobody wonders why I went 6 years without contact with my family or what might have caused that. Just blanket assumption that I'm the bad guy. One aunt sent me a multi-paragraph text about how blood is thicker than water and how I should be the bigger person. I didn't respond. Another uncle called me directly, left a voicemail about how disappointed my grandparents would be if they were still alive to see me turn my back on family. That one almost made me laugh. My grandparents always liked Wyatt better too. Pattern recognition isn't that hard. The most aggressive messages came from my mom's sister. 5 texts in one day, each one more guilt-trippy than the last. Started with gentle persuasion.
When the police told me my sister was dead, I thought it was a tragedy. Then they said I killed her. When the police showed up at my door after my sister disappeared, I thought they were going to tell me she was dead. What they said was so much worse. I texted Meredith 3 times on Tuesday and she didn't respond. By Wednesday morning, I drove to her apartment. The landlord said she'd moved out, taken everything, left no forwarding address. I went home confused. We'd just made plans for Saturday. Brunch at the place we'd gone every weekend since we were teenagers. Thursday morning, 2 detectives stood on my porch. We need to ask you some questions about a recent death. My heart stopped. I thought they'd found Meredith's body. Instead, one pulled out a photo of a man I'd never seen before. Do you know this person? I shook my head. They looked at each other with that cop look, the one that says they don't believe you. Can we come inside? We sat in my living room and the detective leaned forward. This man was found deceased in his apartment 2 days ago. We found your fingerprints on a kitchen knife at the scene. Your hair on his couch. Your credit card receipt in his trash. That's impossible. I've never seen him. I've never been there. They asked where I was Monday night. Home alone watching TV. No alibi. They asked if anyone had access to my belongings. That's when I realized. My spare key. Missing from the drawer last month. I'd assumed I'd misplaced it. My sister Meredith has been to my apartment. I said slowly. The pieces starting to connect. She's been missing since Tuesday. The detectives wrote down her information and left. Told me not to leave town. I spent that night going through my apartment. More things missing. A coffee mug. A scarf. A hairbrush I hadn't used in months. All things covered with my DNA. The detectives came back the next morning with photos from the crime scene. My scarf draped over the dead man's couch. My coffee mug in his sink with my lipstick on it. A receipt with my forged signature. Someone is setting me up, I said, voice shaking. The phone number you gave us for your sister is disconnected. The address is an empty apartment. We ran Meredith Collins and found nothing. No driver's license, no social security number, no records at all. That's impossible. She's my sister. We grew up together. Ma'am, according to your parents, you don't have a sister. The room tilted. I called my mother from the police station, hands trembling. Mom, tell them about Meredith. Tell them she's real. Silence on the line. Then, honey, who's Meredith? My sister, your daughter. Sweetheart, you're an only child. You've always been an only child. The detective was watching me. I could see what he was thinking. Unstable, delusional, dangerous. They held me for 48 hours while my lawyer scrambled. That's when the truth started emerging, piece by piece. My mother had given birth to twins. Identical. But she'd only wanted one child. Meredith was given up at birth to a private adoption agency. Records sealed. My parents never told me. Never told anyone. They'd erased her completely. But Meredith found out. Somehow, somewhere, she'd gotten the records. She'd tracked me down 8 years ago, introduced herself at a coffee shop like it was coincidence, became my best friend before revealing she was my sister. I'd been so happy. A sister I never knew. A connection I'd always felt was missing. 8 years she'd played the role. 8 years of brunches and holidays and late-night phone calls. 8 years of collecting my hair, my fingerprints, my habits, my signature. The victim was her ex-boyfriend. Restraining order. History of stalking her. She'd planned his murder for years. They found her notebook in a storage unit registered under my social security number. Every page detailed how she'd frame me, how she'd disappear, how I'd take the fall for everything. The last entry was dated 1 week before the murder. She abandoned me at birth. She got the parents, the childhood, the life that should have been mine. Now she'll get what she deserves. She wasn't framing a stranger. She was punishing me for existing, for being the twin they kept. My lawyer got the charges reduced. Evidence pointed to Meredith, but she'd vanished completely. New identity, new country probably. She'd had 8 years to plan her escape. I'm out on bail now. The case is technically still open. They can't convict me with the notebook evidence, but they can't convict her either. She's a ghost. I sat at our brunch place last Sunday, force of habit, ordered 2 coffees before remembering. The chair across from me stayed empty. My sister spent 8 years becoming my best friend. 8 years pretending to love me. 8 years waiting for the perfect moment to destroy my life because our mother chose me instead of her. And somewhere out there, she's still watching. I check my locks 3 times before bed now. It's never enough. I sit in my apartment the morning after checking my locks for the 3rd time, staring at my phone and wondering if I should call my parents again, or if there's any point. My coffee sits cold on the table next to me. I haven't slept more than 3 hours. Every small noise makes me jump. My phone buzzes and I grab it too fast, nearly dropping it. Alexander Gates, my lawyer, is texting me. He wants me to come to his office because the forensic team found something else in the storage unit. My hands shake as I read the message twice. What else could there possibly be? I grab my keys and head out, checking behind me twice before getting in my car. The drive to his office takes 20 minutes but feels longer. I check my rearview mirror constantly, looking for cars that might be following me. Nobody is there. I know nobody is there, but I check anyway. At Alexander's office, his secretary waves me through immediately. He's waiting with a manila folder on his desk and his face looks tired. He shows me additional pages from Meredith's notebook that the forensic team found wedged behind a false panel in the storage unit. These pages are different from the ones about the murder plan. These pages detail how she studied my handwriting for 2 years before she felt confident forging my signature. There are practice sheets with my name written hundreds of times, each one getting closer to my actual signature. The progression is clear. Early attempts look clumsy and wrong. Later ones are almost perfect. By the final page, I can't tell which signature is mine and which is hers. The level of patience and planning makes my stomach turn because this wasn't impulse or anger. This was cold, calculated revenge spanning nearly a decade. Alexander points to dates written in tiny numbers at the bottom of each page. She started practicing my signature 6 years ago. 6 years of planning while we had brunch every Saturday. 6 years of perfecting my handwriting while I told her about my work problems and dating disasters. I feel sick. Alexander asks if I'm okay and I nod even though I'm not. He makes copies for me to take home and I don't know why I want them. But I do. Detective Swift calls later that day while I'm sitting in my car in Alexander's parking lot, still holding the copies. She tells me they've identified the adoption agency that handled Meredith's placement. It was called New Beginnings Family Services, and it operated out of Portland until it closed in 2003. The records are sealed by court order from 1995, which means my parents must have requested the seal. Swift is working on getting them unsealed, but it could take weeks or months depending on the judge. She sounds frustrated, and I can tell she wants to give me better news. I thank her and hang up, feeling frustrated that even now, my parents' decision to hide Meredith continues to block answers I desperately need. If they had just told me the truth from the beginning, would any of this have happened? Would Meredith have felt less abandoned if she'd known I didn't know about her either? I start the car and drive home on autopilot, barely remembering the route. I force myself to go grocery shopping because I've been living on delivery food for 2 weeks, and I need to reclaim some normalcy. The store is crowded with people doing their regular Wednesday shopping, and the fluorescent lights feel too bright. I grab a cart and head to the produce section, trying to remember what I usually buy. Apples. I need apples. I'm reaching for a bag when I see her. A woman with dark hair like Meredith's, standing by the tomatoes. My heart stops. She's wearing a blue jacket. Meredith had a blue jacket. The woman turns slightly and I see her profile. My hands start shaking. I abandon my cart right there in the middle of the aisle and walk quickly toward the exit. She turns around fully and I see her face. It's not Meredith. The woman is older with different features. Nothing like my sister except the hair color. I keep walking anyway. I can't stop. I get to my car and sit there for 10 minutes, my hands shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition. A security guard walks by and looks at me with concern, but I wave that I'm fine. I'm not fine. I drive home with no groceries and order Chinese food on my phone. That night, I finally read through all the police reports Alexander gave me about Caleb Sutherland, the man Meredith killed. The file is thick, maybe 50 pages. Caleb was 32 when he died. He worked as a sales manager for a tech company. He'd been arrested twice for violating the restraining order Meredith had against him. The first arrest was for showing up at her workplace. According to the report, he waited in the parking lot for 3 hours until she came out, then followed her to her car. She called the police and they arrested him right there. He spent 2 nights in jail and paid a $500 fine. The second arrest was 6 months later for following her home from a grocery store. He drove behind her for 12 miles and she called 911 while driving. The police met her at her apartment and arrested him in his car across the street. That time he spent a week in jail. The reports paint him as obsessive and threatening, someone who couldn't accept that their relationship was over. I realize Meredith chose a victim whose death might seem justified if she'd been caught. She could have claimed self-defense. She could have said he broke in and attacked her. The restraining order history would have supported her story. But she didn't plan to get caught. She planned for me to take the fall. I call my mother against my better judgment because I need to understand how she could give away a baby and then pretend that baby never existed. The phone rings 3 times and I almost hang up. She answers on the 4th ring, her voice careful and distant. I ask her directly why she chose to keep me instead of Meredith. The question hangs in the air between us. She's quiet for so long I think she's hung up. Then she says it was random. They just picked one. Her voice is flat, like she's talking about choosing between two identical apples at the store. I realize that's somehow worse than any reason she could have given. If she'd said I looked healthier or cried less or had a birthmark she loved, at least that would be something. But random? A coin flip that determined everything about both our lives? I ask her if she ever thought about the other baby, the one she gave away. She starts crying and says she tried not to. She says she had to believe she made the right choice or she couldn't have lived with herself. I tell her I have to go and hang up before she can respond. I sit on my couch and stare at the wall for an hour. My first therapy appointment with Fern Collier feels awkward and forced because I don't know how to explain that my best friend of 8 years was actually my twin sister plotting to destroy my life. Her office is small and painted a calming blue color. There are plants on the windowsill and tissues on the side table. She's maybe 50, with gray hair and kind eyes. She asks me to tell her what brought me in, and I start talking. The words come out jumbled and wrong. I keep backtracking to explain things out of order. She listens without judgment and asks me what I'm most afraid of right now. I tell her the truth. Meredith is still out there, still watching, and I have no way to protect myself from someone who knows everything about me. She knows my schedule, my habits, my favorite places. She knows which window in my bedroom doesn't lock properly. She knows I keep my spare car key in my desk drawer. She spent 8 years learning every detail of my life. Fern asks what I'm doing to feel safe, and I tell her about checking the locks 3 times every night. She doesn't tell me to stop. She says that's a normal response to trauma, and we'll work on managing the anxiety so it doesn't control my life. I cry for the last 10 minutes of the session, and she hands me tissues without making it weird. Alexander files a motion to have my bail conditions modified, so I can at least travel within the state. He argues that I'm clearly not a flight risk, given that I reported the framing myself, and have cooperated fully with the investigation. The prosecutor, Donovan Baird, doesn't oppose it, which Alexander says is a good sign that they're not seriously pursuing charges against me anymore. The hearing is scheduled for Friday morning. I wear a conservative dress and sit quietly while Alexander presents his argument to the judge. The judge is a woman in her 60s who looks stern but fair. She reviews the motion for what feels like forever but is probably 5 minutes. Then she approves it. Just like that, I can travel within state lines. I feel a tiny bit of freedom return, even though I have nowhere I want to go. Alexander shakes my hand outside the courtroom and tells me this is real progress. I thank him and drive home, feeling slightly less trapped than I did this morning. Detective Swift contacts me with news that they found surveillance footage from a gas station near Caleb's apartment. The footage shows Meredith filling up a car 2 hours before his estimated time of death. Swift emails me a screenshot from the video. The image is grainy but clearly shows her face. She's wearing my jacket, the brown leather one that went missing from my closet 3 months ago. I'd looked everywhere for that jacket. I'd assumed I'd left it somewhere and forgotten. But no, Meredith took it. She wore it to pump gas before murdering Caleb, making sure the cameras caught her in my clothes. This evidence further proves the framing, but it also confirms Meredith was meticulous about every detail. She thought about security cameras. She planned what to wear. She probably drove past that gas station multiple times to confirm it had cameras pointed at the pumps. Swift tells me this footage will help my case significantly. I thank her and stare at the screenshot for a long time. My sister is looking slightly away from the camera, her expression calm and focused. She looks like me. We have the same face, the same hair, the same build. Anyone who saw this footage would think it was me. I drive past the coffee shop where Meredith and I used to have brunch, but I can't bring myself to go inside yet. Instead, I park across the street and watch through the window as other people sit at tables and have normal conversations. A couple in their 20s laughs about something. An older man reads a newspaper while drinking coffee. A woman types on her laptop, probably working remotely. None of them are wondering if the person across from them is secretly plotting their destruction. None of them are checking over their shoulders constantly. I sit there for 20 minutes just watching normal people do normal things. My hands grip the steering wheel tightly. I want to go inside. I want to reclaim that space and those Saturday mornings, but I can't make myself open the car door. Finally, I start the engine and drive away, feeling pathetic but unable to reclaim that space yet. Maybe next week, maybe never. The next morning, my neighbor knocked on my door around 8. I'd been up for hours already, checking the locks again and staring at my phone. She looked nervous, kept glancing down the hallway like she wasn't sure she should be here. She told me she saw someone who looked exactly like me leaving my apartment the day Caleb died. She'd thought it was me at first, but then she noticed the shoes. Black heels, the kind with the pointed toe. She said I always wore flats or sneakers, never heels like that. The detail seemed small, but it stuck with her, made her feel weird about it. When she saw the police at my door days later, she started putting things together. I thanked her 3 times, my voice shaking, and asked if she'd give a statement to Detective Swift. She agreed right away, said she'd call the detective herself that afternoon. After she left, I stood in my doorway for a full minute, just breathing. Someone else saw Meredith. Someone else could prove I wasn't the one at that apartment. Alexander called me 2 hours later with more news from the forensic team. They'd found Meredith's fingerprints in my apartment, but not in normal places. Inside my medicine cabinet, way in the back where I kept old prescription bottles I never touched. Inside my dresser drawers, underneath the clothes. In the back of my closet, behind boxes of winter stuff I hadn't opened in months. She'd been going through everything, taking inventory of my entire life. The analyst told Alexander it looked like someone conducting a search, not just visiting casually. I felt sick hearing this. Meredith had touched my things, moved them around, studied what I owned. She'd been in my bathroom, my bedroom, my private spaces. The framing felt almost easier to process than this. She'd invaded every corner of my home while pretending to be my sister, my friend. Alexander asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes. I wasn't okay. I wanted to throw away everything I owned and start over in a place she'd never been. 3 days later, I sat in Donovan Baird's office downtown. The building was all glass and steel, modern and cold. Alexander came with me, sat beside me in the chair across from the prosecutor's desk. Donovan looked tired, like he'd been working too many cases for too many years. He told me directly that his office wasn't going to prosecute me. They were preparing to dismiss all charges formally. The evidence pointed clearly to Meredith now, and they were shifting all their resources to finding her. He apologized for what I'd been through, said he understood this had been horrible for me. I should have felt relieved. Alexander squeezed my shoulder, smiled at me, but I just felt empty. Clearing my name didn't undo what Meredith did. It didn't explain why she hated me enough to plan this for 8 years. It didn't bring me any closer to understanding how someone could pretend to love me while plotting my destruction. I thanked Donovan and left his office feeling hollow instead of free. My second therapy session with Fern happened on a Thursday afternoon. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, the kind of place designed to make you feel safe enough to fall apart. We talked about my sleep, my anxiety, the constant checking of locks. Then she asked me what I missed most about Meredith. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the anger and fear, that I hadn't let myself think about missing her. But sitting there in that quiet office, I admitted the truth. I missed having a sister. I missed the feeling of having someone who understood me completely, who knew my history and my quirks and loved me anyway. Then I started crying. Big ugly sobs that I couldn't control. Because that person never existed. Everything I thought we shared was just Meredith studying me like I was some kind of experiment. Every laugh, every secret, every moment I thought we were connecting was her taking notes for my destruction. Fern handed me tissues and let me cry until I couldn't anymore. She didn't try to fix it or make it better. She just sat with me in the grief of losing someone who was never really there. Detective Swift called me the following week with news about the adoption records. She'd gotten them unsealed through a court order. Meredith had been placed with a family in Oregon right after birth. They returned her to the agency after 6 months. The paperwork said she was difficult and hard to manage as an infant. She spent 2 years in foster care after that, moving between different homes. Then a couple in Washington adopted her when she was 3. They raised her until she turned 18, but the detective said there were notes about behavioral problems and running away. My parents' decision to give her up created this whole childhood of abandonment and moving around. I got to stay in one house, with parents who wanted me, going to the same school and having the same friends. Meredith got returned like a broken product, shuffled around, never settling anywhere. I understood her anger better after hearing this. I still couldn't forgive what she did, but I understood where it came from. One random choice at birth gave me everything and gave her nothing. I forced myself to go back to work on Monday. The marketing firm where I'd worked for 3 years felt different now. Everyone knew what happened because it had been in the news. My coworkers were awkwardly nice, giving me space but also checking on me constantly. Sarah from accounting brought me coffee without asking. Mike from creative told me to take my time on deadlines. My boss called me into her office and told me to take whatever time I needed, that my job was secure. I insisted on working because sitting at home thinking about Meredith all day was making me crazy. I needed tasks, deadlines, normal work problems to focus on. By Wednesday, I'd finished 2 projects and felt almost like myself again. Work gave me structure, gave me something to do besides obsess over where Meredith was hiding. Alexander met me for coffee that Friday to update me on the investigation. He told me Interpol had been notified about Meredith. Her photo was distributed to law enforcement in dozens of countries, but he was honest with me in a way I appreciated. People disappear successfully all the time, especially when they've been planning it for years like Meredith had. She probably had multiple fake identities set up, money hidden in offshore accounts, an exit plan as detailed as her framing plan. The chances of finding her were slim. Even if they did locate her, getting her back to the country could take years. Extradition was complicated and slow. I stirred my coffee and watched the foam swirl. Alexander looked at me with genuine sympathy. He said he was sorry, that he wished he had better news. I told him I appreciated his honesty. At least I knew what I was dealing with. Meredith was gone, probably forever, and I had to figure out how to live with that. The nightmares started that week. Every night I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, convinced Meredith was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. I'd turn on every light, check every window, test every lock. Then I'd lie awake until sunrise, too scared to close my eyes again. The bags under my eyes got darker each day. I looked exhausted all the time. Fern told me this was a normal response to trauma, that my brain was processing the violation of trust and safety. Knowing it was normal didn't make it less scary. I was tired constantly, could barely focus at work. I started drinking coffee all day just to stay awake. My hands shook from the caffeine and the lack of sleep. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. I looked older, worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in the past month. My father called me for the first time since everything came out. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been practicing what to say. He tried to explain their decision. They were young when we were born, only 23. They were scared and broke, and the doctors told them raising twins would be twice as hard. They thought they were making the practical choice, the responsible choice. I listened without saying much because nothing he said would make this okay. We both knew it. The silence on the phone stretched out between us. Finally, he asked if I'd come to dinner this weekend. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood, but I could hear the hurt in his voice. I felt guilty, but also angry. They created this situation. They gave away my sister and never told me. Their guilt didn't fix anything. The coffee shop owner reached out to Detective Swift a few days later. Alexander called to tell me what she'd said. She remembered Meredith asking detailed questions about me over the years. What time did I usually arrive for brunch? Did I always order the same thing? What did I talk about? At the time, she thought Meredith was just being a caring sister, paying attention to my habits. Looking back, she realized Meredith was gathering information, studying my patterns. The owner felt terrible about it, offered to testify if Meredith was ever caught. I told Alexander to let her know she had nothing to feel guilty about. How could she have known? How could any of us have known? Meredith was that good at pretending, that patient in her planning. She fooled everyone, including me, for 8 solid years. I started going through my apartment the next morning, room by room, pulling out anything Meredith had ever given me. The necklace she'd bought me for my birthday sat on my dresser, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. I picked it up and looked at it for a long moment before dropping it in the trash bag. A throw pillow she'd said would match my couch perfectly went in next. 3 books she'd recommended, each one with her handwriting on the inside cover saying she thought I'd love them. A framed photo of us at a concert. A coffee maker she'd replaced when mine broke. Each item felt contaminated now, like touching them might somehow connect me back to her plans. I worked through every drawer, every closet, every shelf. By the time I finished, the trash bag was full and my apartment looked bare. The empty spaces on my shelves and walls made the place feel hollow, but at least I could breathe without seeing reminders of her everywhere I looked. I tied up the bag and carried it down to the dumpster, feeling lighter with each step away from my building. Detective Swift called 3 days later while I was at work. She asked if I could come to the station after my shift ended. I agreed and spent the rest of the day distracted, wondering what new information they'd found. When I arrived that evening, Swift led me to the same interview room where this whole nightmare had started. She spread photos across the table, showing a rundown motel about 30 miles outside the city. The sign out front advertised weekly rates and cable TV. Swift explained that they'd traced Meredith's movements in the weeks before Caleb's murder. She hadn't been living at the apartment address she'd given me at all. She'd been staying at this motel, paying cash every week, using a fake name. The clerk barely remembered her, said she kept to herself and never caused any problems. Swift showed me more photos, surveillance footage from the motel parking lot showing Meredith coming and going at odd hours. She'd been creating the illusion of her normal life with me while actually preparing for everything. The murder, the framing, her disappearance, all of it planned from that cheap motel room while I thought she was living her regular life across town. I stared at the grainy images of my sister walking to and from a motel room I'd never known existed. Swift said they'd searched the room after Meredith left, but it had been cleaned completely. No evidence, no clues about where she'd gone next. My therapy session with Fern the following week felt different. I told her about finding the motel photos, about how Meredith had been living this secret life right under my nose. Fern listened carefully, then introduced me to a concept I'd never heard before. Ambiguous loss, she called it. Grief for someone who isn't dead but is permanently gone from your life. She explained that it's often harder than regular grief because there's no closure, no funeral, no clear moment where you can say it's over and start moving forward. The mourning process never really ends because part of you keeps waiting for resolution that might never come. I sat with that idea for a while, feeling it settle into place. That was exactly what I was experiencing with Meredith. She wasn't dead, but she was gone in every way that mattered. I couldn't grieve her like I would a death because she was still out there somewhere, still a threat, still unresolved. Fern said naming these feelings sometimes makes them easier to carry. I wasn't sure I believed her, but having words for what I was going through did make me feel slightly less alone in it. A letter arrived at Detective Swift's office 2 weeks later, forwarded to her from the Washington couple who had adopted Meredith when she was 3 years old. Swift called me to come pick it up. The envelope was thick, several pages of careful handwriting on nice stationery. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot and read it. The couple expressed deep regret for not being able to help Meredith work through her abandonment issues when she was growing up. They described her as a difficult child who became increasingly troubled as a teenager. She'd run away multiple times, refused therapy, pulled away from any attempt they made to connect with her. At 17, she'd disappeared for good, and when she turned 18, she'd sent them a single letter saying she didn't want any further contact. They respected her wishes, hoping she'd reach out when she was ready. They had no idea she'd found me or what she was planning. The letter ended with an apology, as if they somehow could have prevented all of this if they'd just tried harder or done something different. I folded the pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. These people had tried to give Meredith a home, a family, a chance. She'd rejected all of it because it wasn't the life she thought she deserved. The life I had instead of her. Alexander called me at work the next Monday. His voice sounded pleased when he said the prosecutor's office had officially dismissed all charges against me. The case was closed as far as I was concerned. I should have felt relieved, maybe even happy. Instead, I just felt numb. I thanked him for his work, told him I appreciated everything he'd done. He surprised me by saying he planned to continue helping me pro bono if Meredith was ever located. He wanted to pursue any civil remedies we could, make sure she faced consequences for the identity theft and fraud, even if the murder charges were complicated by her disappearance. I didn't know what to say. Most lawyers would have moved on to their next case, but Alexander seemed genuinely invested in seeing this through. I told him I was grateful, and I meant it. The charges being dismissed should have felt like a victory, but my life was still destroyed in every way that mattered. My reputation was damaged, my sense of safety was gone, and my sister was out there somewhere, free and unpunished. My coworkers invited me to happy hour that Friday, trying to include me in normal social activities again. I forced myself to go, determined to prove I could still do regular things like a regular person. The bar was loud and crowded, everyone laughing and complaining about work stuff that seemed so trivial compared to what I'd been through. I lasted about 30 minutes before the noise became overwhelming and I had to leave. Everyone else was having conversations about difficult bosses and annoying clients and bad dates. Their problems felt so normal, so manageable. I stood there with my drink, feeling like I was watching them through glass, unable to connect with a world where the worst betrayal was a cheating boyfriend or getting passed over for a promotion. I made an excuse about not feeling well and left early. In my car, I sat with my head against the steering wheel, frustrated by how damaged I felt. Meredith had taken away my ability to just exist normally with other people. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. I saw her through the peephole and almost didn't open the door. Curiosity won out over anger. She looked older than I remembered, more gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. She was carrying a cardboard box, and when I let her in, she set it on my coffee table without saying anything at first. Inside were old photos from when I was a baby. She sat next to me on the couch, and we looked through them together. 2 identical infants in every picture. One in a pink onesie, one in yellow. One being held by my father, one by my mother. She pointed to a photo and admitted she didn't know which baby was which. They'd dressed us differently to tell us apart, but in these pictures, she couldn't remember which outfit belonged to which twin. We could be looking at photos of me or photos of Meredith, and there was no way to know. She said something that made my stomach turn. She sometimes wondered if they'd accidentally sent home the wrong twin from the hospital. If maybe I was actually Meredith and Meredith was actually me. I stared at her, not knowing how to respond to that. The idea that our entire lives might have been swapped by chance, that she might have kept the wrong daughter and given away the one she'd meant to keep. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it made everything feel even more random and cruel. Detective Swift called me again a few days later with more bad news. They'd found evidence that Meredith had been using my identity to open credit cards and bank accounts over the past year. The amounts were significant. Nearly $50,000 that she'd never have to pay back because it was all in my name. Swift walked me through the accounts they'd found so far, but she warned there might be more they hadn't discovered yet. I felt sick listening to the list. Meredith had been building financial resources for her disappearance while destroying my credit and leaving me with debt I'd never agreed to. Alexander helped me file fraud reports with every bank and credit card company. We froze my credit, filed police reports, started the long process of proving I hadn't opened these accounts. He explained it could take months or even years to fully clear my name financially. The identity theft was just another layer of violation on top of everything else she'd done. Every time I thought I understood the full scope of her betrayal, something new emerged to show me it went even deeper than I'd imagined. Fern had recommended a support group for victims of stalking and identity theft. I'd been putting it off, not wanting to sit in a room full of strangers and share my story. But after learning about the financial fraud, I decided to give it a try. The group met in a church basement on Tuesday evenings. About 8 people sat in a circle of folding chairs. A woman around my age talked about how her ex-boyfriend had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit, opening accounts and taking out loans in her name before disappearing. The details were different from my situation, but the feeling she described was exactly the same. Having your life hijacked by someone you trusted. Feeling violated in a way that went beyond just the financial damage. When it was my turn to share, I gave a brief version of my story. I didn't go into all the details, just said my sister had framed me for murder and stolen my identity. People nodded with understanding that felt genuine. No one looked shocked or asked intrusive questions. They just listened and understood. For the first time since this started, I was in a room full of people who got it without me having to explain. The prosecutor's office held a press conference the following week, announcing that I'd been cleared, and they were actively searching for Meredith. My name was all over the news again. I had to take the day off work because reporters showed up at my office building trying to get a statement. They called my cell phone, sent emails, even knocked on my apartment door. Alexander handled all the media inquiries. He gave a brief statement saying I was relieved to be cleared and hoped law enforcement would locate my sister soon. I was grateful he dealt with it because I had nothing to say that wouldn't sound either pathetic or full of rage. The news coverage dredged everything back up. My coworkers, who had finally stopped walking on eggshells around me, went back to giving me sympathetic looks. Strangers recognized me at the grocery store. I stayed home for 3 days, ordering food delivery and ignoring my phone, waiting for the media attention to die down again. I took a week before I could make myself walk back to the coffee shop. The building looked exactly the same from the outside. Same brick walls and painted sign, but everything felt different now. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching people go in and out like it was any normal day. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I finally forced myself to get out and cross the street. The door chimed when I pushed it open. The owner looked up from behind the counter and her face changed immediately. She came around fast and pulled me into a hug before I could say anything. She smelled like coffee and vanilla. She pulled back and held my shoulders, looking at me with tears in her eyes. She said she was so sorry, that she never saw what was happening, that she'd answered questions from the police and felt sick about every conversation she'd ever had with Meredith. I told her it wasn't her fault. She insisted on making my usual coffee for free. I took it and looked at our table by the window, the one we'd sat at every Saturday for years. I couldn't sit there. I chose a different table near the back, facing the door so I could see everyone who came in. The coffee tasted the same, but drinking it alone felt wrong. I made myself finish the whole cup before leaving. When I told Fern about it at my next session, she said reclaiming spaces was an important part of healing. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I'd done it anyway. Detective Swift called 2 days later and asked me to come to the station. She had something to show me. I drove there with my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect. She led me to a small room with a computer screen and pulled up security footage. The timestamp showed dates from 3 years ago. The footage was grainy black and white from a storage facility. She explained this was the place where they'd found Meredith's notebook. I watched the screen. A woman walked into frame and I recognized her immediately even though her back was to the camera. She unlocked a unit, pulled up the metal door and disappeared inside. Swift fast-forwarded through hours of footage. Meredith stayed in that unit for 3 hours that first visit. The detective showed me more clips. Meredith came back every few weeks over 3 years. Same unit, same routine. She'd rented it under a fake name and paid cash for everything, but the cameras had caught her face clearly in several shots. I watched her walk in and out, carrying notebooks and boxes, completely calm. She looked normal. She looked like my sister. Swift said the footage proved Meredith had been planning this for years, visiting regularly to work on her revenge plans. Watching her unlock the unit and spend hours inside made my skin crawl. She'd been doing this the whole time we were having brunch together. The whole time she was pretending to be my friend. Fern suggested I take a self-defense class. She said it might help me feel less helpless. I wasn't sure it would make any real difference because if Meredith came back, I doubted I could actually fight her off. But I signed up anyway at a gym 3 blocks from my apartment. The instructor was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and calm eyes. She was patient when I showed up, obviously anxious the first night. The class had about 12 people, mostly women, all different ages. Nobody knew my story, and I liked being anonymous. The instructor taught us basic strikes and how to get out of holds. The physical activity helped. I slept slightly better on class nights. My body was tired in a good way, instead of just exhausted from anxiety. The other students were friendly, but didn't ask personal questions. I could just be another person learning to protect herself. I went twice a week and started to feel a tiny bit less afraid walking to my car at night. My father called on a Thursday afternoon while I was at home. He asked if I was ready to talk to them both. I almost said no out of habit, but something made me say yes instead. I surprised myself. We agreed to meet at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory, not their house. I got there first and sat in a booth near the back. My parents arrived together 5 minutes later. They looked older than I remembered. My mother's face was puffy like she'd been crying. My father looked defeated, shoulders slumped. We ordered food none of us really wanted. The conversation was painful and awkward. My mother cried and apologized multiple times. My father kept saying they'd made a terrible mistake. They tried to explain their reasoning, but nothing they said made it okay. I realized sitting there that they were going to carry guilt about this for the rest of their lives. That didn't fix anything, but it was something. I told them I needed time before we could have any kind of normal relationship again. They both nodded and said they understood. They accepted it without arguing. We ate in mostly silence. When we left, my mother hugged me tight and whispered that she loved me. I didn't say it back, but I didn't pull away either. Alexander called me into his office the following week with new information. He'd been digging into Meredith's background. He'd discovered she'd filed a legal name change 2 years ago. This meant she'd been operating under at least 2 identities, the name she used with me and whatever name she'd changed to legally. He showed me the court documents. The new name was Sarah Mitchell. Completely different. He explained this made finding her much harder because she could have multiple passports and identities layered on top of each other. She might have other names we didn't know about. The FBI was now involved because the identity theft crossed state lines. Alexander had been in contact with an agent who was working the case. But even the FBI admitted the trail was cold. Meredith had been too careful, planned too well. She could be anywhere in the world using any name. The chances of finding her kept getting smaller. My friend Rachel set me up on a blind date with someone she knew from work. I agreed because I was desperate to prove to myself that I could still trust people and have normal relationships. His name was Tom, and he was perfectly nice. We met at an Italian restaurant on a Saturday night. I was on edge from the moment I sat down. I analyzed everything he said for hidden meanings and lies. When he asked about my family, I gave vague answers and changed the subject fast. When he talked about his job, I wondered if he was really telling the truth or making it all up. I couldn't relax. My shoulders stayed tense the whole meal. I kept checking the exits and watching other diners. Tom noticed I was uncomfortable. He asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine. We both knew there wouldn't be a second date. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he was polite but distant. I got in my car and cried, frustrated by how much Meredith had taken from me. I couldn't even have a normal dinner with a nice person without falling apart. At my next therapy session, Fern and I worked on strategies for managing my paranoia and hypervigilance. She taught me grounding techniques for when I started spiraling into worst-case scenarios. She had me practice focusing on my 5 senses to stay in the present moment. She was honest that I might always have some level of anxiety about trust and safety, but she believed I could get to a place where it didn't control my entire life. I wanted to believe her. Right now it felt impossible. Every time I started to relax, something would trigger me and I'd be right back to checking locks and watching strangers. Fern said healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad days. I just had to keep working at it. Detective Swift contacted me again a few days later. She said they'd identified 3 other people Meredith had contact with over the years, who might have information about her plans. They were interviewing each of them. One was a former co-worker who remembered Meredith talking about feeling abandoned by her birth family. Another was a therapist Meredith had seen briefly before stopping treatment. The third was a woman who'd lived in the same apartment building as Meredith years ago. Swift said none of them had seen this coming. They all described Meredith as quiet and private but seemed normal enough. Nobody had suspected she was capable of murder and framing her own sister. The interviews weren't giving them useful leads on where she might have gone, but they were building a fuller picture of who Meredith really was. I got a notification on my phone that someone had tried to use one of my credit cards in Mexico. My heart started racing immediately. I thought it might be Meredith. I called the credit card company with shaking hands. They explained it was regular credit fraud, not connected to my case. Someone had stolen the card number and tried to buy electronics. The incident sent me into a panic attack anyway. I sat on my bathroom floor using all of Fern's grounding techniques to calm. My husband threw tantrums for months, slammed a sauce jar so hard it cracked, flipped the coffee table, and his mom said, "Boys will be boys." So I threw bigger ones back. I married Nathan after dating for 2 years, and everything was great until we moved in together. We had this nice little duplex with a big kitchen and a backyard where I grew tomatoes and peppers. Nathan worked from home doing consulting, and I worked at the veterinary clinic downtown. We split everything down the middle and took turns cooking dinner. Life was good until about 3 months after the wedding when I saw who Nathan really was. We were at the grocery store and I grabbed the wrong brand of pasta sauce. Nathan grabbed the jar from my hand and slammed it back on the shelf so hard it cracked. The store employee just stared at us. Nathan said the sauce had too much sugar and walked off like nothing happened. I bought the sauce anyway because we needed it for dinner. When we got home, Nathan saw the jar in the bag and threw it in the trash. Then he made himself a sandwich and went to his office. After that, the tantrums started happening all the time. If I bought the wrong coffee creamer, he'd pour the whole bottle down the sink while I was watching. If I forgot to record his show, he'd unplug the TV and carry it to the garage. If dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it, he'd take every pot and pan out of the cabinet and stack them on the counter. The worst was when I came home late from an emergency surgery at the clinic. Nathan had thrown every single pillow and blanket from our bed into the bathtub and turned on the shower. He said if I couldn't be home on time, I didn't deserve a comfortable bed. I slept on the couch that night while he sprawled across our king-size mattress. My friend Lisa kept telling me to leave, but I wanted to handle this myself first. Nathan had this whole routine where he'd throw his fit, storm off to his office, then come back an hour later acting like nothing happened. He'd ask what was for dinner or if I wanted to watch a movie. If I brought up what he did, he'd say I was being sensitive and making a big deal over nothing. One time I tried to talk to him about it calmly, and he threw his coffee mug at the wall. Not near me, but close enough that I jumped. Then he said I was being dramatic about a little noise. His mom came to visit, and I tried to tell her what was happening. She watched Nathan flip the coffee table because I forgot to buy his protein bars, and she said boys will be boys. She actually said that. Then she told me her husband used to break plates when he was stressed, and it was my job to keep Nathan happy. That's when I realized nobody was going to fix this but me. So I started matching his energy. When Nathan threw the remote at the wall because the game was buffering, I picked up his gaming headset and launched it out the back door into the garden. He ran outside and spent an hour looking for it in the dark. When he poured out my expensive shampoo because I took too long in the shower, I took his entire shelf of supplements and protein powder and dumped them in the kitchen trash. He had to dig through coffee grounds and old food to get them back. When he knocked all my makeup off the bathroom counter because I left a hair in the sink, I went to his office and swept everything off his desk onto the floor. His laptop survived, but his coffee went everywhere. Nathan started getting confused. He'd throw his tantrum and wait for me to clean up or apologize, but instead I'd throw a bigger one. He threw a book at the door. I threw 3. He slammed cabinets. I slammed them harder. He started yelling that I was crazy and out of control. I yelled back that I was just expressing my feelings as he did. The breaking point came when Nathan's boss called him for an important video meeting. Nathan was in his office, and I was in the kitchen making lunch. I accidentally dropped a pan, and Nathan came storming out screaming about the noise. So I grabbed every pan we owned and started dropping them one by one. Nathan's face turned this deep red color that started at his neck and spread up to his hairline. His laptop screen showed his boss Winston's face frozen mid-question, and I could hear the tinny voice coming through the speakers asking what all that noise was about. Nathan slammed the laptop shut so hard I thought the screen might crack. He started walking toward me with his hands balled up into fists at his sides, and for a second I thought about backing up or apologizing or doing something to defuse the situation like I always did. But I was still holding that big cast iron skillet in my hand, and something in me just refused to move. Nathan stopped about 3 feet away from me, and we just stared at each other while he breathed really hard through his nose. I could see something different in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like fear. Like he suddenly realized I wasn't going to back down this time. He opened his mouth like he was going to yell at me, but nothing came out. Then he spun around and punched the hallway wall so hard his fist went straight through the drywall. The sound was this awful crunch, and then he was shaking his hand and cursing, and he walked straight to his office and slammed the door so hard the whole duplex shook. I heard the lock click from where I was standing in the kitchen. I put the pan down on the counter and my hands were shaking. All the other pans were scattered across the kitchen floor like some kind of crazy obstacle course. I started picking them up one by one and putting them back in the cabinet, and my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. Through the office door, I could hear Nathan talking on his phone, and his voice had this high panicked edge to it that I'd never heard before. I walked closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. He was telling someone that I'd lost my mind, that I'd ruined his important work call on purpose, that he didn't know what to do with me anymore. I realized he was talking to his mother. He kept saying things like, "She's out of control and I can't live like this, and you need to come over here and talk to her." I stepped back from the door and went to sit on the couch in the living room. My phone was on the coffee table and I opened it up to my photos. I'd been taking pictures of everything Nathan destroyed over the past few months without really thinking about why. There was the cracked sauce jar from the grocery store, the soaked bedding in the bathtub, my makeup scattered all over the bathroom floor, the dent in the wall from where he threw his coffee mug, the broken TV remote, my shampoo bottle empty in the sink. I had dozens of photos documenting every single one of his tantrums. Less than an hour later, I heard a key turning in our front door. Nathan must have given his mother a key without asking me because Lorraine just walked right in like she owned the place. She didn't even knock. She came into the living room where I was still sitting on the couch and stood there with her hands on her hips looking at me like I was a misbehaving child. She started in on this lecture about how a wife needs to respect her husband's work time and create a peaceful home environment and be supportive instead of destructive. She said Nathan had important responsibilities and I needed to understand that my behavior was affecting his career. I just sat there listening to her go on, and then I held up my phone. I started showing her the photos one by one without saying anything. The cracked sauce jar, the soaked bedding, my makeup everywhere, the wall damage, the empty bottles. She went quiet as she looked at each photo and her face got this pinched expression like she'd bitten into something sour. When I got to the last photo, she handed my phone back to me and said we both needed to grow up. Not just Nathan. Both of us. Like I was equally responsible for this mess we were living in. Nathan's office door opened and he came out looking all disheveled with his hair sticking up. He and Lorraine went into the kitchen and started having this quiet conversation, but the duplex is small enough that I could hear most of it from the living room. Lorraine told him he needed to handle his wife, and those exact words made my stomach turn. Nathan complained that I'd changed, that I used to be sweet and easy to get along with, that now I was impossible to live with. He didn't mention any of his own behavior, or the fact that he'd been throwing tantrums for months before I started fighting back. Lorraine said something about marriage being hard work, and both people needing to compromise, but then she told Nathan that men sometimes need to be firm with their wives. I wanted to get up and throw something at both of them, but I just sat there on the couch gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. After Lorraine finally left, Nathan came and sat on the opposite end of the couch from me. We sat there in complete silence for what felt like forever. I looked at the clock on the wall and watched the minutes tick by. 1 hour passed, then another. Neither of us said a single word because what was there even to say at this point? We'd crossed into some kind of territory where normal couple communication didn't work anymore. We couldn't just talk about our feelings or work through our problems like regular people because we'd been destroying each other's stuff and yelling and throwing things for months. The silence was so heavy it felt like something physical sitting between us on the couch. Nathan kept clearing his throat like he was going to say something, but then he'd just shift his position and stay quiet. I stared at the wall where he'd punched the hole and thought about how we were going to have to fix that before the landlord saw it. I thought about how much money we'd wasted on replacing things we'd broken. I thought about how tired I was of living like this. That night, Nathan took a pillow and blanket from the closet and went to sleep in his office. I went to our bedroom and lay down on the bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. I kept staring at the ceiling thinking about everything that had happened. I'd matched Nathan's energy like I thought I was supposed to, like I was standing up for myself and refusing to be pushed around. But lying there in the dark, I realized that matching his tantrums hadn't fixed anything at all. I'd just proved that I could be as destructive as him. We were both living in a war zone that we'd created together. The duplex that used to feel like home now felt like a battlefield. My tomatoes and peppers in the backyard were probably dying because I hadn't had the energy to take care of them in weeks. Everything we'd built together was falling apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I'd thought that fighting back would make Nathan see how awful his behavior was, but instead it just gave him an excuse to say I was crazy too. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m, feeling more exhausted than I'd ever felt in my life. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen and found Nathan standing by the coffee maker with this big fake smile on his face. He asked me what I wanted for breakfast in this cheerful voice that sounded completely wrong after everything that had happened yesterday. I just stood there staring at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. I told him we needed to talk about what was happening to us, about the fighting and the destruction, and his mother walking into our house uninvited. Nathan's fake smile got even bigger, and he said there was nothing to talk about if I would just stop overreacting to everything. He said we could go back to normal if I would calm down and stop making problems where there weren't any. I felt something break inside me when he said that. Not in a dramatic way, just this quiet realization that Nathan genuinely believed none of this was his fault. He thought I was the problem. He thought if I would just go back to being quiet and accepting his tantrums, everything would be fine. I didn't say anything else to him. I just went back to the bedroom and got ready for work. I drove to the veterinary clinic downtown and walked in through the back entrance like I always did. My coworker Alyssa was in the break room making coffee, and she took one look at my face and asked if everything was okay at home. I opened my mouth to give her my usual response about how everything was fine, but instead I felt my eyes fill up with tears. Alyssa put down her coffee mug and took my arm and led me into the supply room. She closed the door behind us and I just started crying. Not pretty crying either, but the kind where you can't breathe right and your nose runs everywhere. I told her everything. About the pasta sauce at the grocery store, and Nathan throwing things and pouring out my shampoo and soaking our bedding in the bathtub. I told her about how I'd started fighting back and throwing bigger tantrums than his. I told her about the pans yesterday, and Nathan punching the wall and his mother showing up uninvited. Alyssa listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking and wiped my face with a paper towel, Alyssa was quiet for a minute. Then she said very gently that what I was describing sounded like an abusive relationship. I started to argue with her because Nathan had never actually hit me, but she held up her hand. She said abuse wasn't just physical, and that destroying property and controlling behavior and creating a scary environment all counted. She said even though I was fighting back now, that didn't make it better. She said 2 people destroying each other wasn't a relationship. It was mutual destruction. She asked me if this was really how I wanted to live for the rest of my life. I stood there in the supply room surrounded by boxes of medical supplies and bags of dog food, and I realized I didn't have an answer to that question. I spent the rest of my shift at the clinic going through the motions of my job, while my brain kept replaying what Alyssa said about mutual destruction. I checked a beagle's ears for mites and thought about Nathan punching the wall. I gave a cat her vaccines and thought about me throwing pans during his work call. I cleaned exam rooms and thought about how we'd both become people I didn't recognize anymore. When I finally drove home that evening, I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes staring at our duplex. The lights were on in the kitchen and I could see Nathan moving around inside. Part of me wanted to just keep driving and never come back. But I got out of the car and walked to the front door because running away wouldn't fix anything either. I opened the door and stopped dead in the entryway. The kitchen table was set with our nice plates and cloth napkins we only used for company. Candles were burning in the middle of the table. Takeout containers from my favorite Thai restaurant were arranged on the counter, and the smell of pad Thai and green curry filled the whole house. Nathan came out of the kitchen wearing a smile that looked completely fake after everything that had happened. He asked if I was hungry and gestured at the table like he'd done something amazing. I just stood there holding my purse and staring at this scene he'd created. It was so obvious what he was doing. His mom probably taught him this exact move when he was growing up, watching his dad break plates and then buy flowers the next day. Make a big romantic gesture and pretend the bad stuff never happened. Smooth everything over with fancy food and candles instead of actually talking about the real problems. I walked past him to the bedroom and changed out of my scrubs while Nathan stayed in the kitchen. When I came back out, he was sitting at the table waiting for me with that same fake smile plastered on his face. I sat down across from him and he immediately started dishing pad Thai onto my plate. I watched him serve the food and arrange everything just right, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hope, no sadness. Just this empty feeling like I was watching a stranger perform a play I'd seen too many times before. I put my fork down before even taking a bite and told Nathan we needed couples therapy. I said our marriage was falling apart and we needed professional help to fix it. Nathan actually laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but this dismissive sound like I'd said something ridiculous. He said therapy was for people with real problems like addiction or affairs. He said we just needed to stop being so dramatic about everything and get back to normal. I asked him what normal meant to him, and he said it meant me not overreacting when he got frustrated and him not having to walk on eggshells in his own home. I pointed out that he'd punched a hole in our wall yesterday, and that wasn't frustration. That was violence. Nathan rolled his eyes and said I was making it sound worse than it was. He said lots of guys punch walls when they're mad and it didn't mean anything. I sat there looking at him across the candlelit table with expensive takeout getting cold between us, and I realized he genuinely believed what he was saying. He actually thought punching walls and destroying my stuff and soaking our bedding in the tub was normal behavior that I should just accept. The romantic dinner wasn't an apology. It was a bribe to get me to go back to being quiet and manageable. I stood up from the table and told Nathan I was serious about therapy. He said he wasn't going to waste money on some therapist who would just take my side anyway. I went to the bedroom and closed the door while Nathan stayed at the table eating Thai food by himself. The next morning, I woke up to Nathan's voice coming through the bedroom wall. He was in his office talking loud enough that I could hear every word. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall between our bedroom and his office. Nathan was on the phone with his boss, and his voice had this fake, cheerful tone that made my skin crawl. I heard him say something about construction next door causing noise issues yesterday. He apologized for the disruption to the video meeting and promised it wouldn't happen again. There was a long pause where Nathan wasn't talking, and I figured his boss was responding. Then Nathan's voice got higher and more stressed. He said the construction was unexpected and he'd already filed a complaint with the building management. Another pause. Nathan said he understood the client had been on the call, and he took full responsibility for not warning everyone about potential noise. His voice was getting tighter, and I could tell his boss wasn't buying the construction story. Nathan spent the next hour on damage control calls. I got dressed and ready for work while listening to him talk to different people trying to fix his professional reputation. He called someone named Winston back and spent 20 minutes explaining his home office situation and promising his work quality wouldn't suffer. He called another colleague and asked them to smooth things over with a client who'd been on the disrupted call. Every conversation made him sound more desperate, and I realized his job might actually be in trouble because of what I'd done with the pans. Part of me felt guilty, but a bigger part of me thought about all the times Nathan had made me late for work or disrupted my life with his tantrums, and he never cared about the consequences for me. I was making coffee in the kitchen when someone knocked on our front door. I opened it and found our landlord standing there looking annoyed. He said he'd gotten noise complaints from both neighbors about crashing sounds and yelling coming from our duplex. He asked if he could come in and look around. I let him in because I didn't know what else to do. The landlord walked through our living room and immediately saw the hole Nathan had punched in the hallway wall. He stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then he kept walking and noticed the cabinet door in the kitchen hanging crooked where the hinge had broken during one of our fights. He opened the cabinet and the door came completely off in his hand. The landlord set the broken cabinet door on the counter and turned to look at me. He asked very directly if he needed to be concerned about his property. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Nathan came out of his office right then, and the landlord's whole face changed. He asked Nathan what was going on with all the damage and noise complaints. Nathan immediately switched into this charming, friendly mode that made me want to throw up. He smiled at the landlord and said everything was fine. He said we'd had some minor accidents, but he was planning to repair everything himself this weekend. He put his hand on my shoulder like we were this happy couple, and I had to force myself not to pull away. The landlord looked at Nathan's hand on my shoulder and then looked at my face. He asked me directly if I felt safe in this house. I froze. Nathan's hand tightened on my shoulder. The landlord kept looking at me waiting for an answer, and I couldn't figure out what to say. If I said no, what would happen? Would the landlord call the police? Would Nathan get even angrier? If I said yes, was I lying? Did I actually feel safe here anymore? I finally said I was fine in this quiet voice that didn't sound convincing even to me. The landlord didn't look like he believed me, but he couldn't force me to say anything else. Nathan walked the landlord to the door, still being all friendly and charming. He promised again to fix everything and keep the noise down. The landlord handed Nathan a written warning about the noise complaints and property damage. He said any more problems, and he'd start eviction proceedings. Nathan took the paper and kept smiling until the landlord left. The second the door closed, Nathan's fake smile disappeared. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He turned to me and started yelling about how I'd embarrassed him and made us look like trashy people who couldn't handle our problems. He said the landlord probably thought he was some kind of abuser now because of how I acted. I pointed out that he literally punched a wall yesterday, and the landlord could see the evidence. Nathan said that was different because I'd provoked him by dropping the pans during his meeting. He said if I hadn't started that whole thing, none of this would have happened. I told him he'd been throwing tantrums and breaking stuff for months before I ever fought back. Nathan said I was twisting everything around and making him sound like a bad guy when he was just reacting to my behavior. We stood in the hallway yelling at each other until I couldn't take it anymore and went to the guest room and slammed the door. That night, I got ready for bed in the guest room. I'd brought my pillow and some blankets in there earlier. I was just getting under the covers when I heard Nathan in the hallway. The guest room door opened and Nathan walked in. He didn't say anything, just went straight to the bed and started pulling the mattress off the frame. I asked him what he was doing and he said if I wanted to sleep separately, then I could sleep on the floor or the couch. He dragged the mattress out of the guest room and down the hall to his office. I heard him shoving furniture around to make room for it. I stood in the empty guest room looking at the bare bed frame and felt something break inside me that hadn't broken before. This wasn't anger or destruction during a fight. This was cold, calculated punishment because I'd tried to set a boundary. I grabbed my pillow and went to the living room couch. I lay there in the dark, listening to Nathan moving around in his office and thought about how we'd gotten to this point. I thought about the grocery store and the pasta sauce, and how that first tantrum should have been a warning sign. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for him, or tried to fix things myself instead of leaving. I thought about how I'd started matching his tantrums, thinking it would make him see how awful his behavior was. But instead, it just gave him ammunition to say I was crazy too. The next day at work, my friend Ellie found me in the break room. She'd heard from Alyssa that things were bad at home. Ellie asked if I wanted to come stay at her place for a few days. She had a spare room and said I could have some space to think about what I wanted to do. I sat there with my coffee getting cold in my hands and seriously considered taking her up on it. It would be so easy to just pack a bag and leave for a while. But then I thought about Nathan staying in our duplex acting like he'd won something. I thought about how I'd be the one adjusting and accommodating again while he got to keep his space and his routine. I told Ellie thanks, but I wasn't leaving my own home. Nathan was the one with the problem, and I was tired of being the one who had to leave or change or fix things. Ellie looked worried, but she said she understood. She made me promise to call her anytime, day or night, if I needed help. I promised and went back to work, but I kept thinking about her offer all day. Part of me wondered if I was being stupid by staying. But another part of me was just so tired of running away from problems or trying to make myself smaller, so other people could be comfortable. When I got home that evening, Nathan's office door was closed and locked. I could hear him typing and talking on the phone. I made myself dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. Nathan stayed in his office until after I went to bed on the couch. The next few days followed the same pattern. Nathan worked long hours with his door locked, and I went to work and came home and we barely saw each other. When we did pass in the hallway, we didn't speak. We were living like hostile roommates who happened to be married. I'd wake up on the couch and hear Nathan already in his office. I'd come home and he'd be in there with the door locked. We stopped cooking meals together. We stopped talking about our days. We stopped existing in the same space except for these brief, awkward moments in the hallway where we'd both look away and keep walking. I realized Nathan was avoiding me as much as I was avoiding him. Neither of us knew how to fix what we'd broken, and neither of us wanted to be the first one to try. So we just lived in this Cold War silence that felt worse than the yelling and destruction had been. I worked a late emergency surgery on a cat who'd eaten something toxic. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight. I drove home exhausted and just wanting to collapse on the couch. I unlocked the front door and walked into the dark house. I flipped on the kitchen light and noticed something different right away. There was a new lock on Nathan's office door. Not just the regular door lock, but one of those deadbolts you need a key for. I walked over and tried the handle and it didn't budge. Then I went to make myself something to eat and found another new lock on the pantry door. I stood there staring at the lock on the pantry where we kept all our food. Nathan came out of his office and I asked him what he was doing. He said since I couldn't be trusted not to disturb his work, he was protecting his space and his food. I asked him if he was seriously locking up our food, and he said it was his food since he'd bought most of it. He said I could buy my own groceries and keep them somewhere else. Then he went back in his office and locked the new deadbolt behind him. I stood in the kitchen staring at the locked pantry door for a long time after Nathan went back to his office. My stomach growled because I'd worked through lunch at the clinic and now I couldn't even get to my own food. I walked to the garage and grabbed my toolbox from the shelf. Then I went straight to Nathan's office door and unscrewed the router from the wall jack. I unplugged the modem too and wrapped all the cords around both devices. Nathan's door stayed locked while I carried everything out to my car. I popped the trunk and put the router and modem inside, then locked it and took my keys with me back into the house. About 20 minutes later, Nathan came storming out of his office yelling about the internet being down. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone and I told him the internet was fine, just in a safe place. He demanded to know where it was, and I said he could have it back when he unlocked the pantry. Nathan's face went red and he started pacing back and forth in the living room. He pulled out his phone and I watched him turn on his hotspot and connect his laptop to it. He gave me this smug look like he'd won something and went back to his office. I ordered pizza on my phone since I still couldn't get to any real food. The next morning, Nathan was already in his office when I left for work. I could hear him on a video call talking to someone about quarterly projections. That evening when I got home, he was still in there, but I noticed he kept coming out to check his phone. He'd look at the screen, mutter something, then go back to his office. This happened 3 more times before dinner. Finally, around 8 o'clock, he knocked on the living room wall to get my attention. I looked up from my phone and he asked where the router was. I reminded him about the pantry lock and he said that was different because the food was his. I said the internet was mine then since I paid half the bill. He went back to his office and slammed the door. The next day, I came home to find a package on the porch. Nathan must have been watching for it because he grabbed it before I even got my keys out. He took it straight to his office and I heard him ripping open the box. An hour later, I tried to connect to our Wi-Fi network and it was gone. Instead, there was a new network called Nathan's Network and it was password protected. I tried a few obvious passwords, but none of them worked. At work the next day, I was sitting in the break room watching videos on my phone during lunch. Alyssa came in to make coffee and noticed I was using my data instead of the clinic Wi-Fi. She asked why, and I told her about the separate internet networks at home. Alyssa stopped pouring her coffee and just stared at me. She set the pot down very carefully and sat across from me at the table. She said very quietly that what I was describing wasn't normal. She said I was a smart and capable person who didn't have to live like this. I told her I knew it wasn't normal, but I wasn't going to let Nathan push me around anymore. Alyssa reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said matching his crazy didn't make me strong. It just made me participate in something that was destroying me. I pulled my hand back and said I had to get back to work. I avoided Alyssa for the rest of the day because I didn't want to hear what she was saying even though I knew she was right. Nathan started missing deadlines at work. I could hear him on stressed phone calls with his boss through his office door. One afternoon, he was in there for over an hour and I heard him saying he'd have everything done by end of day. That evening, his office door flew open and Nathan came out looking furious. He said Winston had called him in for a serious talk about his performance. He said his boss was threatening to put him on a performance improvement plan. Nathan stood in the hallway and yelled that this was all my fault for being difficult and making his home life so stressful he couldn't focus on work. I was sitting on the couch and I said nobody forced him to spend all his energy on revenge tactics instead of his actual job. Nathan grabbed his briefcase from beside the door and threw it across the room. It hit the wall right next to the hole he'd punched before and made a new dent in the drywall. The briefcase fell to the floor and papers scattered everywhere. There was a knock on the door 10 minutes later. Nathan and I both froze and looked at each other. I got up and opened it to find our landlord standing there with a clipboard. He did not look happy. He said the neighbors on both sides had reported another loud crash and he was done with warnings. He handed me a formal written notice on official letterhead. The notice said any more property damage or disturbances would result in eviction proceedings. He asked both of us to sign it to acknowledge we'd received it. Nathan came to the door and we both signed our names on the form. The landlord took it back and said he'd owned this duplex for 15 years without any problems until we moved in. He looked at both of us and said whatever we were doing to each other needed to stop or we needed to leave. Then he walked back to his car and drove away. Nathan went back to his office without saying anything. I sat on the couch and looked at the 2 holes in the wall and the scattered papers on the floor. I thought about the locked pantry and the separate internet networks, and the way we couldn't even be in the same room anymore. I grabbed my keys and went out to my car. I sat in the driveway with the engine off just staring at the duplex. An hour went by and I still couldn't make myself go back inside. The house had become this place where everything felt like a battle and I was tired all the time. I wasn't afraid Nathan would hit me because he never had. But the whole environment had turned toxic and every day felt like walking through a war zone. I pulled out my phone and just sat there holding it, not sure who to call or what to say. I ended up calling Ellie around 9 that night, still sitting in my car with the engine off. She picked up on the second ring and I could hear her TV playing in the background. I told her everything about the landlord's notice and the separate internet networks, and how Nathan and I were basically living like enemies in the same house. Ellie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said I could come stay at her place whenever I needed to, that her couch was always available. Then she got quiet for a second before saying, maybe it was time to talk to a lawyer just to understand my options. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there staring at my phone for another 20 minutes before going inside. The next morning, I looked up divorce attorneys during my lunch break at the clinic. I told myself I was just gathering information, not actually planning to leave. I found someone named Patricia Chen who had good reviews and availability that week. I made the appointment for Thursday afternoon and didn't tell Nathan about it. When Thursday came, I left work early and drove to her office in a building downtown. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs and magazines from 6 months ago. Patricia called me back after 10 minutes and we sat in her office with a big window overlooking the parking lot. She asked about my marriage and I gave her the basic facts about Nathan's tantrums and my retaliation. She took notes on a yellow legal pad and asked if Nathan had ever physically hurt me. I said no, he'd never hit me or anything like that. Then she asked about emotional abuse and I froze because I didn't know how to answer that question. Patricia put down her pen and explained that destroying property and controlling behavior and creating a hostile environment all counted as forms of abuse even without physical violence. She said what I was describing fit a pattern she'd seen many times before. She pulled out some pamphlets about domestic abuse and support resources, then told me to think carefully about whether I wanted to try to save this marriage or protect myself by leaving. I took the pamphlets and stuffed them in my purse, then drove home in a daze thinking about the word abuse and whether it really applied to my situation. I walked into the duplex to find a strange man working in our kitchen. He was on a ladder patching the hole Nathan had punched in the wall, and there were tools spread out on the counter. Nathan came out of his office when he heard me come in and explained that he'd hired a handyman to fix all the damage before the landlord came back. The handyman glanced between us and kept working, but I could tell he felt uncomfortable. He probably sensed the tension radiating off both of us. I went to the bedroom without saying anything to Nathan and closed the door. Later that evening, after the handyman left, Nathan found me in the kitchen making dinner. He told me in this cold, formal voice that he was fixing everything so we wouldn't get evicted, speaking to me like I was a business partner instead of his wife. I realized we hadn't had a real conversation in over a week, just these tactical exchanges about practical matters. He asked what time I'd be home tomorrow, and I told him my usual time. Then he nodded and went back to his office. I ate dinner alone at the table, looking at the freshly patched wall. At work the next day, Alyssa cornered me in the supply room and asked how things were going at home. I tried to brush her off, but she wouldn't let it go. She said I looked exhausted and stressed and she was worried about me. I finally admitted that Nathan and I were barely speaking and living like hostile roommates. Alyssa said even if Nathan wouldn't go to couples counseling, I needed to talk to someone because this situation was clearly taking a toll. She pulled up a therapist's website on her phone and showed me the profile for someone named Heidi Molina, who worked with relationship issues and trauma. I took a picture of the screen and promised Alyssa I'd think about it. I called Heidi's office that afternoon and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. The receptionist asked what I wanted to work on, and I said relationship problems, which felt like a massive understatement. When Tuesday came, I left work at 4 and drove to Heidi's office across town. She met me in the waiting room, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the side table. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking about Nathan's tantrums and my retaliation, and everything that had happened over the past months. Saying it all out loud to a stranger made me realize how completely abnormal our situation had become. Heidi asked what I wanted to get out of therapy, and I opened my mouth to say I wanted to fix my marriage, but the words wouldn't come out. I sat there staring at the tissue box and realized I didn't even know if I wanted to save my marriage anymore. Heidi didn't push me for an answer. Instead, she started asking about Nathan's behavior patterns and my responses to them. She explained that what I was describing followed a classic abuse cycle, even though Nathan wasn't hitting me. She said my retaliation was a trauma response to feeling powerless in my own home. Then she said something that hit me hard, that matching his destructiveness didn't give me power back. It just made me participate in my own harm. I left that session feeling like someone had taken everything I thought I knew about my situation and turned it upside down. I kept seeing Heidi twice a week after that first appointment. Over the next few sessions, things started getting clearer in my head. I'd been so focused on proving I wouldn't be pushed around that I'd lost sight of whether this relationship was even worth fighting for. Nathan hadn't changed at all since I started matching his tantrums. He'd just gotten sneakier about his control tactics, like locking the pantry and creating separate internet networks. I was exhausted from constantly being on guard in my own home. Heidi helped me see that I deserved better than living in a war zone, whether I stayed with Nathan or not. 3 weeks into therapy, Nathan's mother called me directly for the first time in weeks. I was sitting in my car outside the clinic after work when her name popped up on my screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me.